We have discussed how IMF is a blessing for Pakistan. Now we are discussing how the IMF is a curse for Pakistan. So, number one, harsh austerity measures and public suffering. Subsidy cuts on electricity, gas, and fuel lead to high cost of living. The common man suffers due to higher taxes and reduced government spending on health and education. When Pakistan turns to the IMF for loans, it usually comes with strict conditions called structural adjustment programs. These are meant to stabilize Pakistan's economy and ensure it can pay back the loans, but they often have heavy costs for ordinary people. सबसे पहले सब्सिडी कट्स. द IMF often asked Pakistan to reduce subsidies on electricity, gas and fuel. This means energy prices rise sharply. इसका इम्पैक्ट क्या पड़ता है कि people pay more for electricity, gas and transportation, which increases household expenses. उसके बाद inflation and high cost of living. When energy and fuel prices rise, the cost of goods and services goes up too, because transport and production costs increase. This leads to inflation, making everyday items like food, cooking gas and transport more expensive. What is its impact? That the common man's purchasing power decreases, basic necessities become harder to afford. High taxes. To meet IMF requirements, the government may raise taxes, especially indirect taxes like sales tax. इसका इम्पैक्ट क्या पड़ता है कि ऑर्डिनरी सिटीजन्स पे मोर फॉर गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज, एडिंग फाइनेंशियल स्ट्रेन. उसके बाद इट रिड्यूसेस गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग ऑन हेल्थ एंड एजुकेशन. कि IMF programs often require Pakistan to cut public spending to balance the budget. Health and education budgets are reduced, affecting hospitals, schools and social programs. इसका इम्पैक्ट क्या पड़ता है? Poor and middle class citizens suffer the most as they rely on public services. सोशल हार्डशिप क्या है कि टुगेदर हाई प्राइसेस, मोर टैक्सेस एंड फ्यूअर पब्लिक सर्विसेज हिट द ऑर्डिनरी population hard. While the loans may stabilize the economy in the short term, the burden falls on common people, creating social frustration and hardship. In short, while the IMF aims to help Pakistan fix its economy, the adjustment measures often cause short-term suffering for ordinary citizens, which is why many see it as a curse rather than a help. उसके बाद डेब्ट ट्रैप एंड लॉस ऑफ इकोनॉमिक सोवरेनिटी. पाकिस्तान बोरोज more to repay old IMF loans, creating a vicious debt cycle. IMF dictates Pakistan's economic policies, reducing the government's ability to make independent decisions. Achha, when we talk about debt trap and loss of economic sovereignty in Pakistan's context with the IMF, it works like borrowing to pay old debts. Pakistan often borrows from the IMF or other sources to repay previous loans, not for new development. This creates a vicious cycle. New loans pay old loans, borrow again. So इसका impact क्या पड़ता है कि the country is always in debt with limited financial freedom. उसके बाद how IMF dictates economic policies. Loans from the IMF come with conditions like reducing subsidies on electricity, gas, fuel, increasing taxes, cutting government spending, privatizing state-owned enterprises like PIA. These conditions limit Pakistan's policy choices. The government cannot freely decide how to run the economy. It must follow IMF rules to secure or continue loans. उसके बाद लॉस ऑफ इकोनॉमिक सोवरेनिटी. वो कैसे? इकोनॉमिक सोवरेनिटी मीन्स मेकिंग इंडिपेंडेंट डिसीजंस फॉर योर कंट्रीज इकोनॉमी. With IMF programs, Pakistan's economic decisions are influenced externally. If we exemplify, if Pakistan wants to keep fuel prices low for the public, IMF rules may not allow it. उसके बाद साइकिल ऑफ डिपेंडेंस क्या है कि because Pakistan must follow IMF directives to get loans, it remains dependent on external financing. This weakens national control over economic policy and can slow down independent development strategies. In short, borrowing from the IMF often traps Pakistan in a cycle of debt, To keep borrowing, Pakistan must follow IMF rules which reduce its ability to make independent economic decisions. This is what is meant by loss of economic sovereignty. उसके बाद हम देखते हैं कि currency depreciation and inflation. IMF often demands a free floating exchange rate leading to currency devaluation. Imports become expensive, worsening inflation and trade deficit. कि free floating exchange rate क्या होता है कि IMF often demands that Pakistan let its currency float freely rather than keeping it fixed. This means the Pakistani rupee's value is determined by the market, not by the government. उसके बाद करेंसी डेप्रिसिएशन कैसे? इन अ फ्री फ्लोटिंग सिस्टम इफ डिमांड फॉर द रुपी इज लो और फॉरेन रिजर्व्स आर लिमिटेड, द रुपी लॉसेस वैल्यू अगेंस्ट द डॉलर. इम्पैक्ट इसका क्या पड़ता है कि इंपोर्टेड गुड्स लाइक ऑयल, मशीनरी, मेडिसिन बिकम मोर एक्सपेंसिव बिकॉज you need more rupees to buy the same amount of foreign currency. Inflation कैसे कि when import costs rise, prices of goods and services go up because industries pass the higher costs to consumers. इम्पैक्ट क्या पड़ता है इसका कि एवरीडे आइटम्स लाइक फूड, फ्यूल एंड मेडिसिन बिकम मोर एक्सपेंसिव क्रिएटिंग इन्फ्लेशन. वर्सनिंग ट्रेड डेफिसिट कैसे कि अ ट्रेड डेफिसिट हैपेंस व्हेन इंपोर्ट्स आर हायर देन एक्सपोर्ट्स. व्हेन द रुपी लॉसेस वैल्यू, imports cost more, Pakistan has to spend more foreign currency. Exports may become cheaper internationally, but sometimes production and competitiveness are not enough to increase exports significantly. Result क्या निकलता है कि the trade deficit can widen, putting more pressure on foreign reserves and the economy. In short, IMF's push for a free floating exchange rate can lead to rupee depreciation, making imports expensive. This triggers inflation, increases the cost of living, and can worsen the trade deficit, creating a cycle of economic pressure. उसके बाद it slows economic growth and job losses. IMF-driven policies often restrict government spending, slowing development projects and causing job losses. Business struggle due to high taxes and energy costs, reducing economic activity. IMF programs often require reducing government spending to stabilize the economy. This means fewer development projects like roads, schools, hospitals, infrastructure. Impact क्या पड़ता है इसका? Construction and related industries see less activity, which slows overall economic growth. उसके बाद जॉब लॉसेस में क्या है कि विथ फ्यूअर प्रोजेक्ट्स एंड लेस गवर्नमेंट स्पेंडिंग, जॉब इन पब्लिक एंड प्राइवेट सेक्टर्स आर लॉस्ट. High energy costs and taxes make it hard for businesses to operate, so they may lay off workers or reduce hiring. Businesses struggle में क्या है कि high taxes and increased fuel and electricity prices raise the cost of production. Businesses find it harder to make profits, which reduces investment and expansion. इसका इम्पैक्ट क्या है कि स्मॉल एंड मीडियम एंटरप्राइजेज व्हिच एम्प्लॉय अ लार्ज पार्ट ऑफ द पॉपुलेशन आर हिट हार्डेस्ट. reduced economic activity वो कैसे कि when people have less income due to job losses and businesses struggle, spending in the economy drops. This creates a cycle: slower growth, fewer jobs, less spending, slower growth. In short, IMF-driven policies can slow economic growth, cause job losses, and strain businesses by reducing government spending and raising costs. This weakens the economy and makes it harder for ordinary people to earn a living. उसके बाद increased poverty and inequality. Austerity measures like cutting subsidies, raising taxes hurt low income families the most. Energy and fuel price hikes make basic necessities unaffordable. Unemployment rises due to slowed economic growth, pushing more people below the poverty line. पावर्टी और इनक्वालिटी कैसे बढ़ती है कि ऑस्टेरिटी हिट्स द पुअर हार्डेस्ट के IMF programs often require the government to cut subsidies on electricity, gas and fuel. and to raise taxes. Impact on low income families. Energy and fuel become more expensive. Basic necessities like cooking gas, electricity and transport cost much more. Middle and high income families can cope, but the poor struggle. Increasing inequality, rising unemployment. Austerity measures slow economic growth because government spends less on development projects. Businesses face higher costs. Energy taxes impact companies, hire fewer workers or lay off employees, causing unemployment to rise. More people fall into poverty. Higher living costs, fewer jobs, more people below the poverty line. जब लिविंग कॉस्ट हाई होगी और फ्यूअर जॉब होंगी तो पावर्टी लाइन बढ़ेगी, ठीक है. फैमिलीज हु वर जस्ट अबव द पावर्टी थ्रेशोल्ड में फॉल इनटू पावर्टी, वाइडनिंग द गैप बिटवीन रिच एंड द पुअर. उसके बाद साइकिल ऑफ इनइक्वालिटी, वो कैसे? पावर्टी एंड अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट रिड्यूस पीपल्स एबिलिटी टू अफोर्ड एजुकेशन एंड हेल्थ केयर, लिमिटिंग अपॉर्चुनिटीज फॉर द नेक्स्ट जनरेशन. इम्पैक्ट क्या पड़ता है इसका? इनइक्वालिटी डीपन्स एंड इकोनॉमिक मोबिलिटी बिकम्स हार्डर. In short, IMF imposed austerity measures like subsidy cuts, high taxes and spending reductions hit the poor hardest. Combined with rising unemployment, this pushes more people into poverty and widens economic inequality. उसके बाद high interest payments and debt servicing burden. Pakistan borrows more money just to repay previous IMF loans. Over 50% of Pakistan's budget goes to debt repayment, leaving little for health, education and development. It creates a debt dependency cycle where Pakistan keeps going back to the IMF for more loans. हाई डेप्ट सर्विसिंग बर्डन कैसे? कि पाकिस्तान ऑफन borrows money to repay old loans or recover budget deficits. A large portion of these loans comes with high interest rates. इम्पैक्ट क्या पड़ता है इसका? कि ओवर 50% ऑफ पाकिस्तान बजट में गो toward paying interest and debt, leaving very little for public services like health, education and development projects. उसके बाद debt dependency cycle, because so much of the budget goes to debt repayment, Pakistan needs to borrow again to meet new financial obligations. This creates a vicious cycle like borrow to pay old debt, borrow again, pay interest and repeat. Reduce development spending. With most resources tied up in the debt servicing, the government cannot invest in infrastructure, social welfare or poverty reduction. Impact क्या पड़ता है इसका? कि economic growth slows, public services suffer and ordinary citizens bear the cost. Economic vulnerability क्या है? कि dependence on the IMF and other external loans reduces Pakistan's economic sovereignty as the country must follow strict loan conditions to secure more funds. In short, high interest payments trap Pakistan in a debt dependency cycle, consuming the budget, limiting public spending and forcing repeated borrowing. This reduces development, hurts citizens and makes the country economically vulnerable. उसके बाद privatization of state owned enterprises leads to unemployment. IMF forces Pakistan to privatize loss making public entities like PIA, steel mills and discos. Thousands of workers lose jobs when these organizations are sold to private investors. Foreign investors buy these companies cheaply, taking profits out of Pakistan. Privatization of state-owned enterprises, वो कैसे? IMF programs often require Pakistan to privatize loss-making public entities such as PIA, steel mills. Reason क्या है? कि the IMF wants the government to reduce financial losses and improve efficiency by letting private companies run them. Job losses कैसे होती हैं? When these organizations are sold to private owners or foreign investors, they often lay off workers to cut costs. इम्पैक्ट क्या पड़ता है इसका? कि thousands of employees lose their jobs, increasing unemployment. उसके बाद profits leaving the country, वो कैसे? Privatized companies are often sold cheaply to local or foreign investors. These investors take profits out of Pakistan rather than reinvesting them locally. इसका impact क्या पड़ता है कि national wealth that was once public is transferred to private hands, often benefiting elites or foreign owners. Reduced public control, वो कैसे? Once privatized, the government loses control over essential services like transport, steel and or electricity distribution. This can lead to higher prices and reduced accessibility for ordinary citizens. In short, IMF driven privatization causes unemployment, reduces public revenue and allows profits to leave the country, while ordinary citizens may face higher costs for essential services. उसके बाद IMF से one size fits all policy doesn't work for Pakistan. IMF applies the same policies to all countries, ignoring Pakistan's unique economic challenges. Pakistan is an import heavy country, forcing currency devaluation, make inflation worse. IMF policies do not focus on export growth, which is Pakistan's real problem. IMF uses the same formula everywhere. The IMF often applies similar economic policies to many different countries, such as devaluing the currency, reducing subsidies, increasing taxes, cutting government spending. These policies may work in some places, but they do not always match Pakistan's unique economic situation. Pakistan is an import heavy economy. Pakistan imports a lot more than it exports, especially fuel, machinery, food items, raw materials. So when the IMF pushes Pakistan to devalue the currency, let the rupee fall, something serious happens. Currency devaluation makes imports very expensive. Because the rupee becomes weaker, Pakistan must pay more rupees to buy the same imported goods. Import prices go up, businesses costs increase, everyday items like fuel, food, electricity, medicines become much more expensive. This leads to high inflation, which hurts the common man. Inflation gets worse, but exports don't grow much. In theory, devaluation should boost exports because Pakistani goods become cheaper for foreigners. But in Pakistan, many exporters still depend on imported raw materials. Energy costs are high, productivity is low, global demand may be limited. So exports do not increase enough to offset the damage while inflation keeps rising. Real issue, weak exports, but IMF doesn't fix that. Pakistan's core economic problem is low export, narrow industrial base, low value added production, but IMF policies mostly focus on raising taxes, devaluing currency, cutting spending. They do not fix export competitiveness, industrial growth or productivity, the real long-term solution. Why this becomes harmful? So IMF say same formula for every country results in higher prices, greater poverty, lower purchasing power, little improvement in exports, economic instability. Pakistan ends up suffering without solving the root problem. In short, the IMF follows a one-size-fits-all approach, but Pakistan's economy is unique. It relies heavily on imports and has weak exports. So currency devaluation and austerity only create inflation and public suffering without building a strong export-led economy. That is why these policies often fail in Pakistan. उसके बाद rising political instability and public protests, IMF-backed tax hikes and price increases lead to public anger and protests. Political instability increases as governments struggle to implement IMF conditions. In some cases, governments collapse due to IMF imposed economic hardships. Political instability and public protest कैसे होते हैं कि प्राइस हाइक होने से पब्लिक में एंगर आती है. वो कैसे कि व्हेन पाकिस्तान फॉलोज IMF कंडीशंस, द गवर्नमेंट ऑफन हैज टू रेज फ्यूल प्राइसेस, increase electricity and gas tariffs, cut subsidies, increase taxes. These price hikes directly hit ordinary people. Food, transport, bills, everything becomes expensive, so people feel frustrated, helpless and angry. Public protest and unrest वो कैसे इंक्रीज होता है कि as the cost of living rises, people begin to protest against inflation, blame the government for economic hardship, demand reversal of price hikes. Sometimes protests become large and widespread, disrupting daily life and increasing social tension. उसके बाद गवर्नमेंट स्ट्रगल्स टू इम्प्लीमेंट आईएमएफ कंडीशंस वो कैसे आईएमएफ कंडीशंस आर ऑफन पॉलिटिकली अनपॉपुलर बिकॉज नो गवर्नमेंट लाइक्स टू रेज प्राइसेस और टैक्सेस. पीपल क्रिटिसाइज लीडर्स फॉर selling out to IMF. Opposition parties use their anger to attack the government. So the government is caught in the middle, follow IMF conditions and face public anger, or refuse IMF terms and risk economic collapse. पॉलिटिकल इनस्टेबिलिटी कैसे इंक्रीज होती है कि ड्यू टू ग्रोइंग पब्लिक प्रेशर गवर्नमेंट लूज पॉपुलैरिटी, पॉलिटिकल अपोजिशन इंक्रीजेस, parliament and institutions face pressure, decision making becomes weak and slow. In some cases governments have collapsed or been replaced during IMF programs because they couldn't manage the public backlash. Economic hardship fuels instability वो कैसे when people lose jobs, struggle to pay bills, cannot afford basic necessities, they lose trust in government and the system. This weakens democracy, governance and social harmony. In short, IMF baked tax hikes and price increases make life difficult for ordinary people. This creates public anger and protests as governments struggle to enforce IMF conditions. Political instability increases and in some cases government even collapse due to economic hardships imposed. उसके बाद it weakens Pakistan's negotiation power with other countries. IMF loans come with geopolitical strings attached. Pakistan loses economic sovereignty. Western countries influence Pakistan's foreign policy because of its IMF dependence, limits Pakistan's ability to negotiate freely with China, Russia and Middle Eastern allies. आईएमएफ के लोन्स पाकिस्तान को कैसे वीक करते हैं, पाकिस्तान का जो नेगोशिएशन पावर है उसको कैसे कमजोर करते हैं कि आईएमएफ लोन्स कम विथ जियोपॉलिटिकल इन्फ्लुएंस. IMF loans are not just economic tools, they also have geopolitical influence behind them, mostly from powerful Western countries who are the biggest contributors to the IMF. So when Pakistan becomes dependent on IMF loans, it indirectly becomes dependent on the countries that influence IMF decisions. उसके बाद लॉस ऑफ इकोनॉमिक सोवरेनिटी के इकोनॉमिक सोवरेनिटी मीन्स अ कंट्री कंट्रोल्स इट्स ओन इकोनॉमिक एंड फॉरेन पॉलिसी decisions, but when Pakistan repeatedly needs IMF assistance, it must accept IMF conditions, it must follow policies acceptable to powerful countries, it cannot freely decide many economic matters. This means Pakistan's freedom to make independent choices becomes limited. Western influence increases वो कैसे? Since Western countries, especially the US and European powers, have a strong influence over the IMF, they can pressure Pakistan through IMF programs. Pakistan may have to align some policies with Western strategic interests. Foreign policy decisions can be indirectly influenced, so IMF dependence can shift Pakistan's strategic balance toward the West. उसके बाद नेगोशिएटिंग पावर विथ अदर पार्टनर्स वीकेंस वो कैसे? व्हेन पाकिस्तान रिलायज हेवली ऑन आईएमएफ लोन्स, इट बिकम्स लेस कॉन्फिडेंट इन नेगोशिएशंस विथ कंट्रीज लाइक चाइना, रशिया एंड द मिडिल ईस्टर्न एलाइज. These partners know Pakistan is financially weak and IMF dependent. Pakistan sometimes cannot fully pursue independent agreements if they conflict with IMF or Washington's preferences. This limits Pakistan's diplomatic flexibility. उसके बाद dependence becomes a strategic liability because IMF help is often needed again and again. Pakistan remains under financial pressure. has to compromise more in international negotiations, appears economically vulnerable, reducing its bargaining power. This affects trade deals, defense cooperation, foreign policy choices, and regional strategy. In short, IMF dependence weakens Pakistan's economic sovereignty. Since powerful Western countries influence IMF decisions, Pakistan's foreign and economic policies are indirectly affected. This reduces Pakistan's ability to negotiate freely with countries like China, Russia, and the Middle Eastern allies, weakening its overall diplomatic and strategic bargaining power. If we conclude, IMF is neither purely a blessing nor entirely a curse. It reflects Pakistan's economic realities. The IMF becomes a necessary medicine when Pakistan mismanages its economy, overspends, avoids reforms, and relies on external borrowing instead of strengthening domestic production and governance. The real issue is not the IMF itself, but our failure to build a self-reliant, transparent, and disciplined economic system. If Pakistan implements long-term reforms, expands its tax base, boosts its exports, and reduces corruption, the need for the IMF will naturally decline, turning the curse into a lesson and the blessing into an opportunity for sustainable growth. अच्छा, अगर हम कंक्लूड करें तो आईएमएफ ना पूरी तरह ब्लेसिंग है ना ही पूरी तरह कर्ज। ये असल में पाकिस्तान की जो इकोनॉमिक रियलिटीज़ हैं उसको रिफ्लेक्ट करता है। जब पाकिस्तान अपनी इकोनॉमी को मिसमैनेज करता है, जैसे ओवर स्पेंडिंग हो गई, बोरोड मनी पर जिंदगी गुजारना, रिफॉर्म्स न करना और डोमेस्टिक प्रोडक्शन को स्ट्रांग न बनाना, ये तो फिर आईएमएफ में एक तरह की नेसेसरी मेडिसिन बन जाता है। ठीक है, अगर पाकिस्तान इस तरह के रिफॉर्म्स नहीं लाएगा, प्रोडक्शन को स्ट्रांग नहीं करेगा, तो जो आईएमएफ है ना, वो पाकिस्तान के लिए एक दवा की तरह जरूरी बन जाता है। ठीक है, जैसे डॉक्टर कड़वी दवा देता है जब पेशेंट सीरियस हो, वैसे ही आईएमएफ की जो पॉलिसी होती है ना, वो भी कड़वी होती है। सब्सिडी को काटना पड़ता है, टैक्स को इंक्रीज करना पड़ता है, करेंसी को डिप्रिशिएट करना पड़ता है। ये सब लोगों को हर्ट करती हैं, परेशान करती हैं, ठीक है, डिस्टर्ब करती हैं लाइफ को। लेकिन ये इसलिए होता है कि क्योंकि पाकिस्तान ने टाइम पर अपनी इकोनॉमी को डिसिप्लिन, ट्रांसपेरेंट और सेल्फ रिलायंट नहीं बनाया। ठीक है, तो रियल जो प्रॉब्लम है, असल जो मसला है, वो आईएमएफ नहीं है, वो रियल प्रॉब्लम गवर्नेंस फेल्यूअर्स हैं, वीक इंस्टीट्यूशंस हैं, करप्शन है और लॉन्ग टर्म प्लानिंग का न होना है। ठीक है, अगर पाकिस्तान अपनी एक्सपोर्ट बढ़ाए, टैक्स सिस्टम को फेयर करे, वेस्टफुल स्पेंडिंग को कम करे, इंडस्ट्रीज को स्ट्रांग बनाए और ट्रांसपेरेंट इकोनॉमिक गवर्नेंस डेवलप करे, तो फिर पाकिस्तान को आईएमएफ पर डिपेंड रहने की जरूरत ही नहीं पड़ेगी। ठीक है, सो कंक्लूजन ये है कि आईएमएफ एक टेम्परेरी सपोर्ट है, परमानेंट सॉल्यूशन नहीं। परमानेंट सॉल्यूशन ये है कि एक स्ट्रांग, डिसिप्लिन्ड, सेल्फ रिलायंट इकोनॉमी बनना। ठीक है, जब तक पाकिस्तान अपने इकोनॉमिक सिस्टम को ठीक नहीं करता, तब तक आईएमएफ के प्रोग्राम्स पाकिस्तान के लिए कड़वी लेकिन ज़रूरी दवा बने रहेंगी। ठीक है, अगर इन दवाओं से छुटकारा चाहिए पाकिस्तान को, तो पाकिस्तान को रिफॉर्म्स लाने पड़ेंगे, इंस्टीट्यूशंस को बेहतर बनाना पड़ेगा, करप्शन को ख़त्म करना पड़ेगा। ठीक है, तो आज के लिए यही था। थैंक यू सो मच, थैंक्स फॉर वॉचिंग।